Hello, it's me, Mr. Fowler, here for our regular Tuesday-Thursday session for English 104, Composition 2, Section 3004. I'm so happy that you're able to chime in today, whether it's during our supposed meeting class time of 10 to 10:15, 10 to 11:15, or at your own convenience. I'm glad that you're here as we have much to talk about this week. Hopefully you already have viewed the video for the first half of this week's discussion course for session 3. If not, it's still there. It's always going to be there and available to you, and you can pursue it at any time that you wish. In fact, we're going to begin today's session with a little bit of a review of what we talked about last time. So let's go ahead and start that, shall we? I'm going to use the share screen and get us over to our class. Here I am once again in the upper right-hand side of your screen. And let's go ahead and discuss session 4. Here's that link to the 4 pillars of argument session that I'm going to refer you to today as we go back and review some of those elements. So if you haven't had a chance to look at this video yet, go ahead and check that video out first. Okay, today we're going to discuss thinking and reading critically. Specifically, we will assess accuracy. We'll discuss convincing support in the reading of others and how to evaluate and consider opposing arguments. We'll also talk a little bit about bias, and I'll have an example that I think will illustrate exactly what is referred to in that context. Then we're going to talk a little bit specifically about reading actively in addition to reading critically. Specifically, I want to cover the basics of previewing, highlighting, and annotating, how you can put them to work for you. And then we're going to discuss what it means to read a text closely. Lastly, I want to spend some time with the steps involved in writing a critical response. Mostly this will be a review if you've already taken English 103 with me, but I know that's not the case for everybody, so this might be a bit of a basis covered bit of material toward the end of the lecture. Then for next time, of course, if you haven't already done so, go ahead and read Decoding Visual Elements. This is going to be an important part of next week's lecture because this will be the lead-in to our first essay, the ad analysis. And I'll be spending some significant time during sessions 5 and 6 talking about how to prep for that particular writing assignment. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a little bit of review. Last time during session 3, we talked about the 4 pillars of argument. And we said that every substantive argument relies on 4 distinct components. Of course, in large part, the very first thing that you have to do is create a compelling thesis, which will compel your reader to adopt some type of perspective, or perhaps, if the case calls for it, even to take a certain type of action. So the thesis is typically the final sentence in the first paragraph or introduction to the essay. Remember that typically introductions are funnel shaped, meaning they move from the most broad or expansive type of information to a very specific point, that being the thesis. Second, you want to rely on the best possible evidence. Now, this evidence should also be included within the thesis itself, meaning that you should state your arguments clearly and precisely as part of your introductory topic paragraph. Beyond that, though, those same topics should appear throughout the body paragraphs within your essay. Usually, it's a good idea if you're looking for a way to gain your audience's trust to return to those same topic sentences and just tweak them a little bit so that they can become excellent transitional or topic sentences for your body paragraphs. So those are two of the key elements that you need. Number three, you need to have a refutation, which means you need to pause somewhere before the conclusion and dedicate at least a paragraph, and maybe even two, to the idea that the opposing perspective from your own has some legitimate concerns or some legitimate ideas. That doesn't mean that you have to agree with them, but you might need to look for the best potential arguments that the other perspective has to offer. Because if you can refute those points, you're going to accomplish a number of positive things for your own essay. Primarily, you're going to present yourself as an authority figure. You're going to get that audience to invest the ethos within you that you're craving, so that you can appear as someone who isn't just advocating for a single perspective, but who has thought about these concepts or issues in a more rounded, full-fledged manner. So you're not just presenting one stilted side of an argument. You're considering the other perspective. Number two, it enables you to become a better, more successful type of writer, because you're going to be able to bring all of those ideas to bear and then refute them, hopefully by introducing good, logical evidence that runs contrary or shows that there are flaws in the logic of this alternative perspective. Lastly, it provides you a chance to, quote, win without actually winning. And here's what I mean by that. Many times when we think about a debate or a logical argument, we think about the effectiveness of that argument or that debated topic as being either a loss or a victory. Now, in reality, it's actually rarely a case that we're ever able to declare a very clear or specific victory. Most of the time, we just do a good enough job to have our audience consider an alternative perspective. That, to me, is a win. Because realistically in society, anytime we can get people to meet us halfway, or at least concede that they're not completely right and that we're not completely wrong, we create a dialogue. And creating a dialogue, whether it be in a written format or if you apply these same ideas to a speech class for an oral presentation, you are making progress. So you don't have to completely defeat the other person's perspective. Like I said, most of the time, the other side is going to have some very good arguments. But if you can compel your audience to see flaws in the logic or the evidence that they're presenting, your perspective is a little bit easier to sell, so to speak, in the minds of your audience. They're more willing to provide that sense of pathos that you're seeking to get through to them vis-a-vis the message you were delivering. Okay, that's it for the review of session 3's material. So if you still feel that you need clarification or you just have some questions on that end, you may want to email me for more details. Okay. So those, again, are the 4 pillars of argument. A lot of you have also been active talking about and discussing the ways in which you were either convinced to see an opposing viewpoint or perspective, or what you think it might take to get you there in our weekly discussion thread. So I encourage you, if you've not yet chimed into this week's discussion thread, to do so before Friday at midnight. Let's move ahead to today's material then. Thinking and reading critically. Okay, so this all breaks down on page 59, starting on 59, and then thoroughly in 60 to 63. So we're going to spend some time talking about the ways in which we can think critically and read critically also. So let's discuss those. So for thinking and reading critically, one of the first things that our authors describe in chapter 2 is the idea of thinking critically. Now, thinking critically might have a lot of different definitions. I even taught a course once that was called critical thinking. It was very akin to this course. But thinking critically, as our authors define it, our authors, of course, just as a reminder, being Kerzner and Mandel, that thinking critically is not simply accepting ideas at face value, but questioning ideas and analyzing them to understand them better. So I think sometimes there's a degree of confusion. Say that again. There's a degree of confusion about what it means to think critically. So when you think critically, it doesn't mean that you need to question everything an instructor is saying or everything that you are reading as you read it or as your instructor says it. Doesn't mean your hands up constantly saying, well, I disagree with that because of X, Y, and Z. That's not exactly what they mean. They mean that you should digest the material in a thoughtful way. So when you're sitting in a lecture class or watching a video lecture like this one, you should watch it all the way through. And now that you have the ability to watch the video and pause it, you should write down questions and you should indicate interesting points of view as you go through and watch the lecture. That's implying that you're taking notes, either electronically or vis-a-vis traditional pen and paper or pencil and paper or something like that. That's not a bad idea. But you could also go back and just create a list of host questions for yourself as you have watched the video the first time. And then as you go back and review the video or go back and review your notes, then you could create questions that you could send to someone like myself or your other instructors in an email, or that you could contact via a one-to-one Zoom conference or something like that, just to seek clarification. And I'm always, by the way, willing to do that if you're interested in that. If you're interested in that possibility. Okay, so when they say think critically, they're talking about not just accepting as truth what you have heard, or if you're thinking about the text itself, you may want to annotate or highlight certain portions of your text and question the authors of the texts that you're reading in order to ascertain whether or not their ideas are logical or they're presenting flawed information. I think this will be very applicable to our reading of The Princess Bride when we get into that text after Labor Day, specifically after the 15th of September. But until that point in time, I will say or suggest, because like I said, you should think critically, consider all the things I'm saying. Most of the time, textbook authors are just trying to present pretty essential information. So when Mandel and Kerzner and Mandel rather are writing about critical thinking, you don't have to fact check them most of the time. You're more than welcome to, but I think that it might just be a routine and frustration and repetitiveness for you. All right, they break down a couple of specific types of critical thinking techniques on pages 60 and 61. I'm not going to read all of them because you have the text, you've read them thoroughly by this point, but I want to highlight a couple of them. First of all, analyzing visual texts. We're going to talk about that in great detail next week. But when you examine an image, they say you should use critical thinking to develop ways to help you understand what it is you're seeing using previewing, highlighting, and annotation. Sounds familiar, right? Okay. When you analyze an argument's logic, you use critical thinking skills to help you understand the relationships among ideas and the form of the argument that they take, as well as determining whether or not its conclusions are valid and true. That's going to be a critical step for our middle assignment, especially. Okay, so what does it mean then to go from thinking critically to reading critically? Well, there are essentially 3 types of steps that you should take with a text. And I'll tell you that, in truth, if I am being honest about my own college experience, there were some things that I did naturally or processes that I picked up that I thought were helpful, and others that I really hadn't been exposed to until it was my turn to teach these techniques. So take that with a grain of salt. What worked well for me might work well for you, or things that I were not aware of or left on the floor might be the key to helping you continuing your educational process by sharpening your critical thinking or critical reading, in this case, skills. The first one that they suggest is previewing. Now, this could be a matter of design principles. Most textbooks are designed in a way that introduce material fairly systemically. So they'll have a series of titles, subheadings. Most textbooks that are published today begin with a series of lecture questions or discovery questions. And if they don't have those, they almost always have some summary or review portions near the end of the chapter that can help you focus your time and attention while reading. And that's why I got hooked on previewing. Not because of some benign idea of making sure that I was reading the most effective portions of the text, or that I was even focusing on what material that I need to read, but rather it was because if that section didn't show up in a study question or a review session at the end of the chapter or beginning of the chapter, I usually didn't read it. Now, that changed by the time I got to college because the grading was a little bit more rigid and the range of discussion topics was a bit more broad, as you would think should be true of most college experiences. It became more challenging. Excuse me for a moment. But that's why I got hooked on previewing. It wasn't because I was a great student. It was because it made the study process easier for me. But realistically, you should preview any type of chapter reading that you have to see that you are focusing on the most critical things. This will help you read more critically and get more out of a reading session. Now, the second portion or second suggestion that they bring to your attention is on page 67. Here they talk about highlighting a text, and they say the following. When you highlight your text, you should use underlining and symbols to identify the most important parts of the essay or the chapter. And this is just a pretty basic review process that you can engage in either after a close reading or just a standard original initial read through. So you can do it post reading, post your initial reading, or in addition to your first read through. Either way, that's up to you. Now, I'll be honest with you, I did not do a lot of highlighting, note taking, and annotating of my texts. We'll talk about annotation in more detail in a few moments. But what I did do is that when it came time to select my textbooks, I always went to the used bookstore at my college and I would thumb through texts that were available. I wouldn't wait. I always got them the first week they were available, and I asked to thumb through a couple of copies until I found one where someone had already done quite a bit of work highlighting and annotating texts. So I let someone else do the work for me, and then I used their annotations and study tips and techniques to guide my reading. So there you go. Little tip from your college professor on how to get the most out of your textbook, including how to annotate and highlight material. Now the next bit is described on page 70 and 71, and this is annotating. So annotating means taking notes of your questions, your reactions, and your own specific ideas for discussion or writing later on. The best places to do that are in the margins of a text. Let me see if I can hold on to this real quick. As you can see, there are wide margins on either side of the page and above and below. And those are specifically designed for note-taking. So they don't use these small font types and stick the content in the middle of the page for just no reason. There's a specific design principle behind that, and that's to create marginal space for students to use the text and take notes. I think that's a great idea. Now, did I do a lot of annotating as a student when I was an undergrad? No, not really. I annotated my own notes, but I didn't usually bother with the text. However, as I got older and as I became a professor, I found myself annotating my texts relatively frequently, as well as highlighting and underlining certain passages. And not just textbooks either, but actual books that I read for my own sense of satisfaction and note-taking capability. So from experience, I can tell you that even though I didn't do this as a student, it is a technique that may be worth your time and attention. And who knows, adding this skill to your repertoire now might save you some frustration or headaches in the future. It's a little bit of food for thought. Okay, after this portion, I believe I asked you to skip ahead to 77. And I wanted to pause for a brief moment real quickly before we get into writing a critical response. I just wanted to commend many of you for reading some of the interesting passages from this chapter. A lot, and I think that's wonderful. Like I said, it's not required reading, but if you have the extra time, there are some great argumentative essay examples here, especially if they're compelling or interesting to you, that you can read, and I think that will only further enlighten you as to how to be effective in constructing a critical writing argument. Speaking of critical writing arguments, this next part will probably be a little bit of review if you've already taken 103 with me. It's kind of philosophical material. But if you haven't taken 103 with me, or you just want a refresher, this is good material to wrap up the video with. Specifically on pages 77 to 78, our authors discuss what it means to write a critical response. Let's begin with their definition of a critical response. A critical response is a paragraph or more in which you analyze ideas presented in an argument or express your reactions to those arguments. Does that sound familiar? It probably should. If nothing else, it should sound like the examples that we've already accomplished during week 1 and that many of you have added to this week in our discussions for week 2. That's exactly what the weekly discussion questions are all about. We are in the process of crafting critical responses each and every week. So a lot of what we have created in terms of our responses for in-class writing or in-class discussions that we've written this semester or a little bit last semester qualify as these critical responses. So there are a couple of specific things that you should do. And our authors walk us through them. They say the first thing that they do is identify the author and try to provide some sort of synopsis for what exactly their argument is. Now, if you've already done this sort of thing before, you know why exactly this is their first suggestion. Going back to the last chapter and the idea of orienting your audience to the rhetorical context, this is essential. In order for them to invest any sense of ethos or authorship in you, you need to express to your audience what the topic under discussion actually is, what the potential points or solutions may be, and then elaborate on how your version of the answer either agrees with or disagrees with those same solutions. So that's a very critical and intelligent first step. Establish some background material for your audience so that they can understand the context a little bit better. Okay. The second thing that you should do is outline, how do they say it here? Sorry, I lost my place. There it is. You should have a good idea what the writer wants to communicate to your readers as well as how they make their point. So you have to be able to understand and explain their argument points. Because if you don't understand what it is they're saying, it's going to be difficult to create an effective argument against or even in agreement with what your opponent has already said. I like to use the analogy of a conversation. Think about yourself entering a swank party. And when you arrive, you're fashionably late, which means there are people who have begun to collect in little groups and they're discussing things. And as is natural, you probably would move from group to group and hover around the perimeter of each of these groups until something interesting caught your attention. Then you would probably segue into that conversation and you would consider what had already been said. And then you would make a statement. And then the group would talk about that. But at some point, it has to be time to leave. So you leave the party, but the conversation may continue even in your absence. So with writing, that's why you have to be especially careful with how you establish and present your evidence. Because if you don't understand the context of what's said, and then you speak, the things that you say may be, or the things that you write, more importantly, may be misinterpreted if you're not there. So when you're preparing your writing, it pays to make sure that you're clear in terms of what the other argument points are and how you will respond to the evidence that's presented to you. Okay, you should always begin your critical response, like I said, by identifying your source and its author. Then you should analyze their supporting points, taking them one at a time. And then consider whether the writer addresses all of the significant opposing arguments and whether they're refuted convincingly. So one of the things that you should look for in terms of places to potentially strike are any flaws in logic. Now, most arguments are not presented in such a way that there are no flaws whatsoever. You may be hard-pressed to find flaws, and that's okay to acknowledge in the refutation. But perspective is another issue altogether. Perspective provides you with a greater sense of wiggle room so that you can argue potential points within the context of what's being discussed. Harkening back to one of the examples in this chapter, one of your fellow students, Zach, took a look at the argument in favor of violent video games. And there is a little bit of a contention between the terms violence and action, right? Can action be nonviolent? Well, yeah, it absolutely can. Sporting games like Major League Baseball, Madden, I think there's one called The Game, and then of course the Madden series, which focuses on professional football, are video games that contain lots of action, but don't necessarily focus on violence. So a lot of times the ideas of violence and action become conflated. And as our author suggests, at first, it may seem that there is a corollary between violent video games and people who react violently in the real world. However, we run into one of those eccentricities in logic that has been proven time and again by statistical data that more frequently than not, the countries and the players that play the most and spend the most time with video games, especially video games of a violent nature, do not have a representative tendency toward violence. So for example, Japan, the people of Japan play video games more frequently and more aggressively than we do here in the United States. Yet the rate of recidivism and criminality and violence is quite low in Japan. Similarly, we play a lot of violent video games here in the US. But if you look at the demographics of players of violent video games, it's very few of them, a very small percentage, that actually engage in real life violence. So there is an argument to be made that although what seems to be logical, you play violent video games, you are more aggressive or more violent, actually in point of fact does not tend to be true. And some people would argue that in point of fact, violent video games as well as traditional sports are a better, safer outlet for natural aggression and violent tendencies that develop within our society. It's a way to deflate violence as opposed to amping up violence. On the other hand, you have someone like author Stephen King, who writes quite a bit of material that is dark and violent. And he has said that he believes that a book or a record album, as he calls them because he's of that era, cannot inspire violence, but can act as an accelerant to people who already have an existing violent nature. So to that effect, he believes it is the responsibility of the artist or the creator to mitigate the way in which that violence is portrayed. So that's a little food for thought. But getting back to the critical response, just as I demonstrated, you should quote, summarize, or paraphrase the writer's key points in a very careful fashion. One, to avoid basic issues like plagiarism, but two, to make sure that you're not unintentionally misrepresenting someone's argument in order to make it align more closely with your own. And that's a nice temptation that we always have to avoid as writers and that we have to be aware of so that we don't slip into that slippery slope. Slip into that slippery slope? Well, yeah, you get the idea. But the point being is this: you need to use the best evidence. And in support of that evidence, oftentimes a really good quotation from an effective source can help to underline the ideas that you already bring to bear for that idea. And this is my last key point for the session. Evidence and quotations are not necessarily the same thing. You can use quoted material or summarized material from another author in support of a piece of evidence. But the evidence itself should be from your mind, from your experience. And you should seek to make logical connections in the reading, which leads back to why you should critically read, meaning annotate and highlight the passages of the material that you're reading and ask questions as you go through the process. Now, even saying that, I know not everybody's going to annotate and highlight. I know it's just not a reality. There are lots of things that you are responsible for each and every day, including classes besides this one and life outside of your coursework. But if you really want to make the best possible argument, and if you want to use argumentation as a skill and use this class as a potential to learn how to do that well, part of that's just doing the work. And you may want to take advantage of some of these or techniques or other ideas that you've come across in some of your other classes. So that's it for practical argument for this session. Next week, we're going to read the entire chapter of the text. I'm going to give you that page listing real quickly. Again, that's just going to be decoding visual elements. It's about 15 pages, so not quite as long as some chapters, but probably not the longest reading that you're going to be assigned for next week either. Pages 83 to 98, and I'm going to use a lot of that as a sort of framework for guiding us through the next lecture and preparing us for our ad analysis assignment, which is coming up very quickly in September. As always, if you've got questions or concerns for me, Mr. Fowler, make sure that you reach out to me through email, or it's okay again to just request a one-to-one or Zoom session meeting in which we can make sure your questions have been answered. So that's it for me. And until we meet again next week, I bid you all the best. Take care, folks.